After committing a terrible deed, a young man flees and eventually realizes that someone else is being wrongly accused of his actions. The distinction between a sin and a crime is noteworthy, as not all sins are considered criminal, although most crimes are considered sinful. It is important to note that nobody wakes up one day and intentionally chooses to take a wrong path in life. It often occurs by accident or due to carelessness. For Nick Rogers, it was really a question of vanity. He wanted things, he deserved things, and suddenly a golden opportunity to have it all presented itself. Nick was a scholarship student. He was handsome, charming, and off the scales bright, but he was dirt poor. The fact that he was at one of the world's foremost universities, rubbing shoulders with the best and the brightest, didn't help one bit. Whatever his classmates wanted to do, Nick couldn't afford. He couldn't afford the bespoke denim, the crisp linen shirt, the sensuous cashmere sweaters, or the skiing holidays in Switzerland or Argentina. Nick could barely afford a second beer at the campus pub, and he definitely couldn't afford to ask the gorgeous Dara Wellerton out to dinner. Instead of focusing on his studies, Nick started obsessing about what he was missing out on. He'd go home at the end of the day to the small room he rented in Mrs. Dore's house, whose single charm was the price and the fact that it was a mere 3 blocks walk from the university. As for Mrs. Dore's, like the house, she had seen better days. She might once have been a beautiful woman, but lonely bitterness and fear of the future made her harsh and miserly. She was constantly screaming at Nick to mind the switch off the lights and not spend too much time in the shower. Nick had seen her pay for her grocery deliveries out of some heavy ceramic jars filled with quarters she kept on her kitchen shelves. And of course, Mrs. Dore's didn't tip. She'd carefully pay out the bill, doling out each nickel and dime like it was gold, then recount it with a suspicious air as if she thought the grocery delivery man of cheating her. Usually, Nick just crept up the stairs and avoided her altogether if he could help it, but that fateful evening he grabbed a tin of soup and a roll on his way home, so he walked into the kitchen to fix his meager dinner. He opened the kitchen door and was shocked to see Mrs. Dore's lying on the floor, an overturned stool by her side, and one of the huge ceramic jars she kept on the high shelf in shards around her. The kitchen light glittered on the small silver and copper coins, and then Nick saw something else. There were rolls scattered among the coins. His thumbs prickled. All thought of the unconscious Mrs. Dore's fled his mind. He picked up the faded green object. It was a roll of $50 bills held together with a cheap elastic band. And there, by Mrs. Dore's foot, was another and another. Nick quickly gathered the bills, then he looked up at the ceramic jars. Could it be that every one of those jars was filled with $50 bills? Was miserly Mrs. Dore's rich? Nick clambered up onto one of the chairs and carefully inspected every one of the jars.
Also, if you've not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these animal stories every day. Now, back to the story.
By the time he was finished, he had accumulated what looked like hundreds of thousands of dollars in old bills. He ran upstairs, got his few belongings together, and shoved the money into his laundry bag. He took one last backward glance to make sure he'd left no trace of his presence in the kitchen and saw Mrs. Dore's again. He should call 911, but then they traced the call to his phone. Nick hefted the laundry bag, then looked at Mrs. Dore's lying there with varicose veins showing in one twisted leg and her chin hanging on her chest. The money, of course, Nick chose the money. He ran, which was a mistake. Greta Ferris, Mrs. Dore's next-door neighbor, saw him jump the fence and grew suspicious. She peeked into her neighbor's kitchen window and immediately raised the alarm. It was one of those raggedy long-haired students, Mrs. Ferris told the policeman. I wouldn't be surprised that he did pour Daphne in. Daphne was Mrs. Dore's name. Have you checked the money? The detective raised an eyebrow. Money? Did she keep her pension money in the house? He asked. Pension? Scoffed Mrs. Ferris. Daphne was a rich woman. She buried 3 husbands and never spent a cent, didn't trust banks. Her grandma went hungry during the Depression, and she told Daphne the only safe money is in your hand. The detective and the CSI team immediately started treating the kitchen as a crime scene, and the detective found one of the bill rolls that had fallen under one of the counters. A lot of money, he mused. He got greedy, she protested. He pushed her. Mrs. Dore's was in the hospital and still unconscious, but Mrs. Ferris identified the man she'd seen running away from the house as an indigent boy who was always asking for work and begging for a crust around the neighborhood. He was arrested, and it seemed justice was satisfied. Meanwhile, things weren't so rosy for Nick. He thought having everything he wanted would be a blast, but every time he touched that money, he felt dirty. He saw the poor, unlovely Mrs. Dawes sprawling on the floor. He turned on the TV in the luxury hotel suite he'd moved into. Mrs. Dawes' stash was well over $750,000 and saw the headlines, "Suspect in elderly lady's attack arrested." Nick watched the snippet in horror. The poor boy they'd arrested had obvious mental health issues, and he did bear a passing resemblance to him. "He's going to jail," Nick told himself. "You are going to be a good man, a great man. You are going to change the world," he cried angrily at himself. "Look at you, Nick. What are you? A thief, a coward who let someone else take the blame." 3 days later, a sleepless Nick walked into the police precinct and asked to speak to the detective in charge of Mrs. Dawes' case. He placed the laundry bag on top of his desk. "The money is all here," he said. "I never hurt her. She had fallen off a stool, I think. But then I saw the money. I took it, but I never hurt her." The detective looked at Nick sadly. "We know that," he said. "Mrs. Dawes is now conscious and will make a full recovery. But no thanks to you. If Mrs. Ferris hadn't raised the alarm, she would have died." Tears streamed down Nick's face as he acknowledged, "I know, I understand that. That's why I'm here. The other individual didn't play a role. I want to confess and make things right. This isn't the kind of person I aspire to be." Nick made amends and apologized to Mrs. Dawes. Though he was sentenced to a lengthy period of community service, he believed he had atoned for his mistakes by the conclusion of his sentence.